friends, and welcome to the latest issue of the Wiser newsletter. You'll see that I'm back at my house. We had a great August down at the beach, but as they say, it's always good to be home. Now, for this week's issue of the Wiser newsletter, I've got some great stories to tell you. The first story is about shutting down the internet, and I was amazed when I saw the research that came from Access Now about the extent to which the internet is being shut down by authoritarian governments. Then I have some research from a friend of mine, Charles Radcliffe, who has been looking at the power consumption of Zoom versus Teams. And you'll be amazed that there is a difference between which of these video platforms you use. On the subject of power consumption, I have some more data about Bitcoin mining. And finally, I have part 2 of China's BigTech crackdown. Now, you know that I covered this in detail a few weeks ago. Well, there's so much news coming out of China that I want to continue telling the story of how China is going about this whole thing. And before I get to the first story, I just want to give you an update on where we are with the newsletter. Now, I'm currently upgrading the website. I've put a new theme on my Ghost platform, which has involved me writing my own HTML code. And it's 30 years since I was writing any kind of programming code. So that's been quite an interesting and enlightening experience. But the new theme does mean that I can organize the content in a more structured way and help you find it easily. So you've got a new search facility. You've got a thing called topics where you can search by Apple or Elon Musk, and it will give you all of the content that relates to those particular tags or topics, as I'm calling them. There's a new landing page for members to sign up. And remember that there's a 30-day money-back guarantee for anybody that's signing up to the newsletter if you're just not satisfied with the content. So let's get started. Let's talk about the top story today, which is around government-imposed shutdowns on the internet. Between January 2019 and June 2021, there were 228 major internet shutdowns in 41 countries. Now, I couldn't believe this when I read this the other day. And this comes from research that was in an extraordinary report from the digital civil rights group called Access Now. And it was written in conjunction with Jigsaw, which is the think tank from Google / Alphabet, however you want to look at them. Now, I have to say that when I did read this research, and it is a long read, it felt like I'd had a metaphorical bucket of cold water thrown over me. And I must confess a high degree of ignorance when it comes to the subject of internet shutdowns. I just didn't know it happened as much as it does. Access Now have traced the origins of internet shutdowns back to 2007, and the first widely known shutdown was in Guinea, but only about 1% of the population was affected. However, the first nationwide closure of internet borders, affecting around 93% of the population, came during the Egyptian revolution a decade ago in 2011. Mubarak turned the internet off for 5 days. Around 3,500 individual border gateway protocol routes, these are the networks that are used to communicate across the global internet, were withdrawn on orders from the Egyptian government. This action cut the country off from the rest of the world, bringing internal communications to a dead stop. Since then, governments worldwide have carried out partial or nationwide shutdowns at least 850 times. 90% of them happened in the last 5 years. The longest and still ongoing internet shutdown is in Myanmar. It began in June 2019 when authorities blocked access in western Myanmar amid an escalation in violence between the military and the Arakan army. Following a military coup on the 1st of February this year, access was briefly restored to the region, while the rest of the country faced a total shutdown on internet access. However, 5 days later, access was again cut in the region. Connections remain unreliable across the country. Now, the main driver for these shutdowns is to stifle dissent and criticism of the ruling government during periods of unrest, oppression, or elections. But the impact is felt more broadly, impacting healthcare, education, the economy, and communications, aka reporting with the outside world. Fascinating report, and I urge you to go to the website, follow the link, and read the full report from Access Now. It really did change my view on what is going on in the world. Now, the other person that affected my perspective on this was a guy called David Mattins. Now, David writes an excellent must-read newsletter. It's one of my go-to newsletters every time he publishes it. It was Mattins' newsletter that brought this report to my attention. And he makes the point about the rise of the splinter net, essentially saying that if we looked a decade ago, we did believe that the internet would prove to be an unstoppable force for globalization. Nothing we thought could stand in the way of the unifying power of the open web. But here we are a decade later, and instead, the rise of the splinternet is happening in front of our very eyes. The emergence of several internets governed by nations or regional power blocks, each with its own rule and information filters. The primary split, of course, will be between China and the rest of the world. But as my friend Richard Turin pointed out to me, you're also seeing it in Russia, parts of the Middle East, and even in what you'd call the westernized Singapore has its own restrictions on internet usage. This is a fascinating subject and one that I will be covering again, I'm sure, in the coming months for Wiser. If we were setting up a call and it was a choice between Zoom or Teams, would you ever take into account the amount of power consumption one of those apps takes over the other in terms of choosing which one you'd want to use? Well, a couple of months ago, I was on a call with a friend of mine called Charles Radcliffe. He's a super interesting guy. I've known him a while, and he's always telling me stuff about emerging tech and how it impacts our lives. Now, he told me that he was looking into the power consumption of Zoom versus Microsoft Teams. Now, it did seem an odd thing to me at the time until he explained that he'd observed his laptop running harder when on a Teams call than for Zoom. And he wanted to understand why, because that's the sort of bloke that he is. Late last week, just as I was putting the latest issue of Wiser to bed, he sent me a note to say that he'd published his observations in Forbes, and he sent me the details overnight so that I was able to get them into the latest issue of the newsletter. Now, you'll find the link to the whole article if you go over to the website, but in essence, the headlines are Teams uses 2 to 3 times more CPU than Zoom for video calls. You could save 75% of your electricity if you just turned off the video. Using a virtual background increases your power consumption by up to 18%. And Teams is more efficient on Windows and Zoom is more efficient on a Mac. In fact, Zoom is very efficient on the new Apple M1 device, which is what I use, so I'm feeling quite happy with myself. Now, when it comes to comparing the two, there are many factors to take into account, and this was an observational study. I do know that Charles reached out to both Zoom and to Microsoft to ask for comments, and only Microsoft responded, but it was pretty much a holding statement. Charles is now going on to do a more broader piece of research where he's going to be looking at the other video platforms like Google Meet and GoToMeeting. And I can't wait to bring you that when he's finished that as well. Now, on the subject of power consumption, did you know that the University of Cambridge runs a power consumption index for Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining? Now, I know that you've read about Bitcoin mining power consumption in Wiser before, but this latest research did tickle my fancy and I wanted to share it with you. First, it is worth understanding that measuring this is no easy task, and the actual energy consumption for mining Bitcoin can only be estimated. But the team at the University of Cambridge have come up with a great visual comparison to help put this into context. And the one that I like the best is this one. If you combined all of the power consumption of all the fridges in the United States, it would be about 10% more than all the Bitcoin mining in the world. And finally, I just want to bring you an update on China's BigTech crackdown, part 2. Now, China is really redefining the relationship between big tech, the people, and the economy. And I covered this in detail, and there's a video about this from a few weeks ago, which is doing very well on the YouTube channel. But things are moving very quickly in China. Now, last week, China introduced a wide-ranging privacy and consumer protection law. This law is similar in many ways to GDPR in the European Union, and it will give Chinese citizens significant consumer protections. However, the new privacy law goes further than GDPR because it's more than just consumer protection. There is a huge emphasis on what's broadly called national security, but you can actually translate to be data. The new law tackles the data sovereignty question of where is it and who controls it. This was at the heart of the Trump administration's spat with the TikTok ByteDance group a year ago. You may remember that Trump signed an executive order compelling TikTok's owners, ByteDance, to sell their North American operations. It was a move that was more about posturing than protection, and inevitably it never happened. But the point is that the battleground of data sovereignty was defined, and now China has made the move that defines what it means in China's internet, which is that the new law requires that all data that is broadly defined as critical information has to be stored in China. This does include user data. Now, this has big ramifications for non-Chinese tech firms operating in China, such as Apple, which is the largest foreign business in the region, because the new law prohibits foreign law enforcement agencies from accessing data of Chinese nationals without going through an onerous approvals process. Now, Apple earns around $55 billion a year in the region, and it's growing. And more importantly, Apple's supply chain is based out of China and Taiwan, where just about every iPhone, iPad, and Mac computer is made. Apple CEO Tim Cook has made privacy a strategic differentiator between themselves and the rest of the ad revenue based big tech. According to this New York Times investigation, Apple is storing Chinese user data in systems that are easily accessible by the Chinese government. There's no evidence that the Chinese government has actually used that ability to access the user data. But the point is that the lines are being redefined in China, and it's going to definitely affect Apple. And now another significant move in the big tech crackdown in China was this culture known as the 996 culture. 996 simply refers to the working hours, so it's 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, hence 996. China's Supreme Court and its Ministry of HR has just ruled that this 12-hour working day culture is a serious violation of Chinese labor law. And because the 996 working culture is so big in the China tech space, this is being seen as further evidence of a clampdown on the working culture and the attitude of big tech towards people and their role in society. And it doesn't stop there, because China has also imposed new rules that prevent anyone under the age of 18 from playing video games for more than 3 hours a week. The ban also prohibits playing of video games at any time during school hours. These are measures to tackle online addictions, and they come just a month after Chinese state media called video games spiritual opium. These new laws are all about redefining the relationship between big tech, the people, and the economy. These laws are designed to give new protections to Chinese citizens at the expense of big tech, whilst also putting up barriers to stop foreign-owned firms from being used as a backdoor route for spying in China. It's a strange world that we live in. Anyway, folks, that's all for this week's issue of the Wiser newsletter. There's so much more if you go to the online version and look at it on the website, because there I've got charts, I've got graphs, and I've got significantly more content. As always, if you've liked this video, please give me a like, and please remember to subscribe, because that way you'll be the first to know when I've uploaded a new video for the Wiser newsletter. That's all for this week, and remember, inside information gives you leverage. Take care. See you next week.